Hey there knitters, happy August and welcome to episode 51 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter and I'm a tech editor. Over my little summer hiatus over the last 3 months, while I've stepped away from making these videos, I've had some adventures that were both good and I won't say bad, but I'll say challenging. My husband has started taking lessons to become a glider pilot. So I had the opportunity to take a flight before he started taking the lessons, just so that I got a sense of what he was in for. And it was quite a trip. There's nothing quite like flying at 3,500 feet in almost total silence. The challenging aspect of my summer has been that I managed to roll my ankle not long after I stopped making my videos. I didn't really think much of it because I've rolled my ankle several times in my adult life, so I didn't really do any special care. It has unfortunately converted into a bit of Achilles tendonitis. So my heel is quite swollen. Walking has been quite a challenge. So thankfully, I have had the excuse to recover by sitting and knitting, which brings me to what I've managed to do this summer. So when I left you all in episode 50, I talked about using the time to achieve some of the goals that I had for the year. And I achieved the 2 that I really wanted to get done. Okay, like 1.5. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today, is both of those 2 goals that I have achieved. And the heart of today's episode is going to be talking about row gauge and how we approach garments with a larger stitch motif in them to allow for variances in row gauge. So that'll be the big talk about in this episode. That was strange grammar. That's what we're going to talk about in this episode, but please stick around to the end of the episode because I've got a big announcement that I would really love to share with you, and it also ties into the goals that I was looking to achieve over the summer. So as I think I've mentioned at the end of last episode, although I haven't gone back to watch it, I am going to Rhinebeck this year. I have been once before back in 2018, and this year I'm going with 2 of my besties, Becky and Tammy, who joined me in an episode last November, episode 34. If you want to check out that episode, it was fun and cute, and we were knitting in California. I do have a link to that in the description below as well. But as many of you probably know, if you've heard of the Reinbeck Sheep and Wool Festival, it's tradition to knit a Reinbeck sweater before you go to wear on the hill. There's a big meetup on the hill. Ravelry takes a huge group photo of everybody, but it's also a wonderful way for everybody to kind of fawn over each other's hard work. There will be a flood of knitters who are wearing designs from people like Andrea Mowry or Caitlin Hunter, and you get to see all of the colors that people have chosen that differ from the original design. But a lot of people will also wear things that they have designed on their own. And this year, or I guess I should say back in 2018, I wore a self-designed sweater, and it was a bottom-up inset sleeve style sweater with a rhombus pattern up the front. And I didn't publish it for a lot of reasons. The first was that I was pretty new to grading patterns, and I didn't feel wholly confident that I would be able to grade it to fit the bodies in the range of sizes I wanted to offer it. The second was that it was an inset sleeve style sweater. Those can be challenging. Even for me, I'm a confident knitter, but I find inset sleeves somewhat intimidating. And I find them a little fussier, and I don't particularly like fussy. I had just taken a grading class that talked about inset sleeves, and that's why I took that approach. But the third reason I didn't publish that pattern, no matter how much I loved it, was the row gauge problem. So as many seasoned garment knitters may know, when you are knitting something that has to fit around you, stitch gauge is queen. It's what determines the size of the thing that goes around you, whether it's a cowl or a hat, socks, or a sweater. If you cannot match both the stitch gauge and the row gauge that the designer has set in the pattern, we aim for stitch gauge, because we can change the length of something by knitting more or fewer rows, but we can't change the circumference of a garment without applying modifications mathematically. So we want to achieve the stitch gauge, and the row gauge will just be what it is. And that theory of just letting your row gauge be what it is all fine and good if you're working in stockinette stitch, or if you've got a very short vertical repeat. Say you have a vertical repeat that you work up the length of the garment of 4 rows, right? You can kind of fudge the depth a little bit if you have to end on a specific row. 1, 2, or 3 extra rows here and there generally won't impact how the garment fits too much lengthwise. But what about when you've got a really large pattern repeat like we did in my Reinbeck sweater from 2018? If you're working a garment like that from the bottom up, you've got a lot of considerations to make room for when it comes to your row gauge, and most specifically the depth of your yoke. Since this was my sample, I was able to tweak things a little bit to make the pattern fit nicely at the neckline so that the stitch pattern was complete. But trying to grade this garment for different sizes, where the yoke needs to be a different length, can be an absolute nightmare when people are trying to work on the project if their gauge doesn't match. I can spend all day grading it to make sure the exact number of rows is worked for a yoke to achieve the finished pattern at the neckline, but if your row gauge doesn't match, because it doesn't always, right? Your stitch gauge may match, but your row gauge doesn't, what are you gonna do? So whether you're working a garment top down or bottom up, the depth of our yoke is pretty critical. In terms of a drop shoulder style sweater, they are what sets the circumference of the upper sleeves of our sweater. In a raglan sweater, it's what sets the circumference of the body and the sleeves based on the rate of shaping. And even in an inset sleeve, if your yoke depth is too long or too short, when you pick up the required number of stitches for your sleeve, or when you try to sew your sleeve into the armhole if it's not a contiguous sleeve, you can end up with puckering. So making sure that our yoke depth is accurate for the number of stitches that we're going to be putting into that hole for the arms is really critical. So let's take a quick look at the 3 most common bottom-up methods of garment construction and what limitations there are when it comes to row gauge. In my opinion, the least flexible style of sweater would be a raglan style yoke. Since a specific number of rows are required to work the shaping by means of increases to achieve the target yoke length without making modifications, if your row gauge varies from that of the pattern, you can run into issues of it being too long or too short. In episode 6, I talk about how to modify a raglan yoke, so it's not impossible, but it's the type of yoke that would most commonly need a mathematical modification if your row gauge varies significantly from the pattern. If you have a small variance, it's generally okay if your yoke is just slightly longer or just slightly shorter than the pattern calls for. My threshold is generally 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters. But if it's any more than that, you'd likely want to look at modifying the number of rows worked to ensure that your yoke is within the right range of length. Next up would be an inset sleeve yoke that is probably the next flexible, but flexible-ish. While a specific number of rows do need to be worked to shape the lower edge of the armhole, those shaping rows generally don't encompass the entire depth of the yoke. There is generally a knit even section where you can simply work to a target length without any further increases or decreases. You can adjust your number of rows worked if your gauge varies from the pattern after all of the decreases are worked. And lastly, the most flexible yoke style, in my opinion, if you have a difference in row gauge, would be a drop shoulder style of garment. Since there's no shaping along the armhole edge, you can work as many or as few rows as you need to achieve the target length or target depth of yoke for your gauge. So now that we know a little bit more about the flexibility, or potentially the lack of flexibility, in the depth of a yoke based on row gauge and the method of construction, let's talk about how that relates to designs. And we're going to use my Rhinebeck sweaters as an example. Notice I said sweaters. So when we design a sweater, and specifically the length of the body from the underarm to the hem, to make it equitable across all body sizes, we generally set one length. So if my size 1 has a body length from underarm to hem of 13 inches, my size 11 has a body length from underarm to hem of 13 inches. So I'm just rolling my eyes to make sure I said 13 inches in both cases. All that to say, the body length from the armhole to the hem will be the same across all sizes. There does seem to be a misconception across garment industries, not just the knitting industries, that a larger circumference body equals a longer body. And I know I've talked about this before, but I'm living proof that that just is not true. Just because I'm larger in circumference than someone else doesn't mean I'm taller than them. Actually, quite the opposite. I have relatively short arms and not a particularly long torso. So because I'm aware of those factors, I try really hard to make my garments equitable across all body circumferences. So all of that to say, if we say that 13 inches is our target length across any size, if you have a longer row gauge than what a pattern calls for, it will take you fewer rows to achieve your 13 inches. If you have a shorter row gauge than the designer calls for, it will take you more rows to achieve your target length of 13 inches. So understanding that a variance in row gauge means that you will work a different number of rows than the original pattern calls for to reach a specific length, that can have a really big impact on where you end a design repeat up the length of a body. And this stopping point is going to be the critical issue in the yoke. If you have a really large pattern repeat, such as in my Reinbeck sweater, where you have to have at least 24 rows to complete a pattern repeat, that variance in row gauge can have a huge impact on your ability to achieve the target yoke depth in a sweater. So I feel like I've just talked about a lot of problems, but not a lot of solutions. So because I love this sweater and I would love to see other people make it, but I recognized the issues with it being a bottom-up construction and acknowledging that people's row gauges are going to be variable, I had to make a decision. And it was a hard decision because I had already written and graded the pattern, well, for a couple sizes. Admittedly, I didn't get through all 11 sizes. But I had written and graded the pattern for a bottom-up inset sleeve style garment. The work had already begun. But when I thought about accessibility of the pattern and the recognition that our row variance between those 24 rows that you need to complete a pattern, it was just too much to even consider publishing. I didn't think anybody was going to knit it. If I wasn't me, the designer, I probably wouldn't have knit it because it's just too fussy. So what's the solution? Designing sweaters top down. So by working the pattern from the top down, we can ensure that the target yoke depth is matched because you can just stop the pattern at the underarms where you need to and then continue it through the body. So we can make sure that you work the start of the chart at the correct height so it's equitable for all sizes, and then it will flow seamlessly throughout the remainder of the body. Is there still going to be the issue of needing to end your chart with a specific 24 rows at the bottom of the sweater? Yes, absolutely. But I feel like there's more flexibility because you can adjust the length of the body itself so that you end with the correct chart repeat at the bottom before the hem. And you can also vary the length of the hem if you need to achieve a specific length. So we're still prioritizing making sure the stitch count or the stitch chart is correct before you finish, but there's a lot more flexibility in the length of the garment below the arms than there is in the garment above the arms. So I hope you enjoyed what we've just talked about. As I was designing and knitting this sweater, I thought so much about row gauge and whether this would be something relevant for us to talk about. And I think it was. I think it helps us gain an understanding of why a designer might design something top down versus bottom up. While a lot of drop shoulder sweaters are knit bottom up because it's easy, you start in the round and then you split the front and back. Sometimes taking the extra steps of working it top down, which does mean that you're going to have a little bit more construction detail. You'll have a few extra ends because of where you have to join things to start working the yoke as a whole piece as opposed to each shoulder separately. But I think it makes the garment construction process a lot better for the end user. Plus, when a sweater is designed top down, you have the added bonus of getting to try it on as you're knitting. So at the start of the episode, I mentioned a big announcement, and this has to do with my second big goal for the summer. I mentioned that I was thinking about hosting a sock masterclass, and it's finally going to be happening. So over the last 3 months, I've been refining the designs that I wanted to offer to you and the details to make it a really jam-packed educational experience for you. So starting mid-September, I'm going to be hosting a 4-week sock mastery course that will focus on my favorite construction techniques, the math behind making socks that truly fit you or someone you love, and by the end of it, you will have the skill to take on any pair of socks to make sure they fit you in the way that you want. So more information on that will be coming soon, but mark your calendars. Our class is going to be going to be going on sale on Friday, August 30th. That's just in a couple of weeks. And the first instructions and live video sessions where you're going to be able to ask me questions in person will begin on Friday, September 13th. And we're going to assume there's no bad karma on starting on Friday the 13th. There will be yarn kits from my favorite yarn store. There will be some cute little accessories to go with it from one of my favorite accessories company. And we're going to get to do a lot of math together. And I know there are some math-focused people in this group, and I love it. So stay tuned to this channel over the next couple of weeks to learn more about it. And if you want to make sure that you're notified as soon as the class goes on sale, sign up for my newsletter. I generally only send a newsletter once a week to notify you, or every 2 weeks, I guess I should say, to notify you of new episodes. But there's going to be a bit of an email blast as we get this class ramping up, and then it'll go back to our regular bi-weekly. If you have more questions about garment construction and the reasons behind it, feel free to leave a comment below, or you can submit a request form through my website. Again, I will link to that below. As much as I have enjoyed my summer hiatus, just leaving a little bit more room for creative pursuits, I'm really excited to be getting back into this with you for the fall, and we are going to be resuming our bi-weekly videos starting today. So we will have one more full episode before the end of the month, so keep your eyes peeled for that. To make sure you never miss an episode of Knit Talk, make sure you hit that subscribe button below. And if you enjoyed it, give me a thumbs up. It makes me feel good and tells the YouTube algorithm that we're doing something good, so it lets more people know what we're doing here. In 2 weeks' time, I'm actually going to be up in Canada. I haven't been home in 5 years. So the husband and I are packing up the dogs. I'll be packing up a bunch of knitting, and we are driving up to go see family. So I'll be shooting the episode there, so you'll get to see a slightly different surroundings. My hometown. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed our discussion, and I look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. Happy knitting!